Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail through to organizational transformation and onto change in society and the world. My name is Andy Polaine. I'm a service designer and innovation consultant, coach, educator, and writer. My guest today is Daniel Stillman, a conversation designer, and he's just written the book Good Talk: How to Design Conversations That Matter. Daniel, welcome to Power of 10.
Andy, it is a distinct pleasure to be here with you, honestly.
Thank you. It's I've been listening to your Conversation Factory for a while too, the podcast that you also run, which I should have mentioned in the title. Let's come back to what a conversation designer is in a second, or maybe we can do that by asking you, how have you got from here to where, or from there to where you are now?
Yeah,
What's
really.
your journey here?
Yeah, I mean, where's there and where's here? But those are deeper questions. I mean, so like in a nutshell, like I actually wanted to be an exhibit designer when I went to industrial design school. So I went to industrial school at Pratt. And this is going back more than a decade. And I thought to myself, I studied science and I was like, I loved education. And I thought like, oh, this is so cool. You can make a space and just set people loose in it and they can learn. Right. And so I just love this idea of automatic education. But it turned out that in order to do that, I was working at the Museum of Natural History. And I thought maybe I would be able to sneak my way in. And I was managing a research lab, a secret lab on the roof of the Museum of Natural History. It was really one of the coolest jobs I've ever had. The elevator to my office was gigantic, like big enough to put a dinosaur skeleton into it. But it was a nowhere job. I was making nothing. And so I remember going around and interviewing people about how to get into this design world. And this guy was like, well, you need to study design. Ha ha ha. And he had there was a 2-year program in exhibit design, but it was like an associate's degree. And I'd already had a bachelor's and I was like, I don't want to go to a 2-year program that gives you basically a nothing degree. And so I went to what was a 1 year? Anyway, I went to Pratt and I studied industrial design. I got my master's, and along the way in industrial design, I think what I discovered was human-centered design, co-creation, and
all that good stuff.
All that good stuff, that the design process. And I also discovered that the museum industry, because I actually wound up doing a studio in exhibit design, I realized that the museum exhibit design world was like a really slow-moving, political, challenging context. And so I wound up working in product design, or what was called what the only type of products that product design was back then, right? This goes to our Slack rant the other day, designing physical products. But this being 2007, we were on this cusp of also starting to my boss realized that like everything we were designing had a screen and someone else was designing for the screen.
And those two things were separate.
And so,
yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. So we were designing the TV and going off and doing all these interviews on the future of home theater. And then somebody else was designing the interface for the TV. And so they made a very concerted effort. They said like, what is this interaction design thing that's going on? And they sort of set me off to go learn about it. And I discovered the Interaction Designers Association and started going to those conferences. And so in a way, I feel like my work has been a growing awareness of other types of design. And so I was in industrial design, and then we were doing this hybrid total design where we were like, okay, well, we're doing interaction design, but most of the people talking about interaction design are talking about web design. We were designing weird ebook readers and modular computers and GPS devices and whatnot. And then service design popped up in my awareness, and experience design. And it was in 2015, I'd started just teaching design thinking to non-designers in about like maybe 2010, 2011, 2012 was when I started doing it full time. I didn't know that it was an industry. I just thought like, wow, I learned all this stuff after design school. Everyone should know this and we can collaborate together better. Wouldn't that be delightful? Very naive, I guess. Also, there wasn't really an industry when I started in it. And so in 2015, I worked with a group in Australia called Second Road.
Yes, who I know.
And who you might know. And I did a small stint with them as a consultant, and they called their facilitation practice. And I'd sort of identified as a facilitator, and that workshop design and facilitation design was something that I was good at and enjoyed teaching people. They called what their practice conversation design, which I found very confronting. Because I was like, you're not designers, and designers are a very petulant group. Like, as much as we talk about co-design and co-creation, we still are, I believe, very possessive of what's about the actual design and, the boundaries of who gets to be part. We invite you in, right? You don't just call yourself designers. And I was like, what does it mean to design a conversation? And they have a very interesting perspective on it. And it really was eye-opening for me and very confronting, as I say. And I remember in January of 2016 doing 4 test interviews with 4 professionals that I respected on what they thought it meant to design a conversation. And I interviewed Dave Gray, who co-wrote Game Storming and Liminal Thinking and other books. I interviewed Abby Covert, who wrote How to Make Sense of Any Mess and is, brilliant and a beloved friend. I interviewed Leland Mashmeyer, who's now the chief creative officer at Chobani. I eventually had him on my podcast. And my friend Philip McKenzie, who is a cultural consultant and also a DJ. And to me, I was like, well, what does it mean? Maybe this is the next type of design. I think that's what my hypothesis was. And that's how I got to here. This is the long story, but it's like, it took me a year to actually officially start my podcast after that. But I think the whole time I was like, we're all just designing conversations. I was doing a lot of work with the Luma Institute in 2016. And I was like, all these templates and all these modalities, they're just ways to design a conversation, being like, okay, let's do some abstraction laddering. And if you know the game, you can play the game. And it's a design for dialogue. And so that it just infected my brain, and that's how I got to where I am now, which is just a hopeless, over-intellectualized hack.
That's not true. It's interesting, one of the things I had a similar realization a while ago, and I remember I was facilitating a workshop or teaching it, I think, and said, all of these methods exist because we don't have telepathy. Almost everything that you're trying to do in all of these design methods I'm trying to extract something that you have in your head and get it out there and make it tangible in some way so that I can mix it in with the thing I have in my head.
Yes. And then hopefully incept in your mind where I want you to go with the project.
There's that too. But I mean, there's an awful lot of, a lot of the process is really about that. It's really about trying to make tangible the thing that I have, in your head. I don't know if you've read the book by Ken Cosienda. It's called Creative Selection. He's an ex-Apple engineer, and he's the guy who designed came up with the predictive touch typing or predictive texting on the iPhone when they shut down the whole kind of development of everything because they couldn't get the keyboard right. And so they had all the design teams, all the engineering teams working on demos of keyboards. And he talks about the demo culture, and he worked with a Dutch guy, I think it's called Bas, somebody whose name I've forgotten, who did all his demos in Macromedia Director, which I was really happy to hear, to try things out. And he goes in quite a lot of detail about this whole idea of, if you've got an idea in your head and I've got an idea in my head of something, we can argue forever about it because there's still ideas in our heads. And we can kind of say, no, it gives an example of a puppy. And it said, well, my puppy's much cuter than yours. And it said, even if you do a kind of crappy sketch of it, that kind of helps. But, then it's like, oh, but your sketch is better than mine. It's not until you do a demo of a thing. And for them, it's not a prototype, it's a demo. It's this is how the thing would be.
Yes.
You can actually, you've got that artifact in front of you and you can actually have a proper conversation about it. Does this work? Does this not? And so forth.
So can we unpack what this idea of having a proper conversation is? Because I think it's really interesting. One of the things that woke up for me when I started the podcast in earnest and started interviewing people on this, I don't know if you want to call it a conceit, but it really was a curiosity for me of like, if we can design conversations, and I say we can, what are we designing when we design them? And what are they made of? And I interviewed this guy named Paul Pongaro, who's a professor of cybernetics.
I know his work.
And and his diagram of modeling a one-on-one conversation has this really interesting implication for me as a former UX designer, is that conversations have an interface. Like they have a place where they happen. And the place where most conversations are happening is in our heads and the air. And so our heads, we actually can think. I unfortunately I forget the statistics and I should know them better, but you know from your own experience that you can think a lot faster than you can express. Right. And we also think incredibly non-linearly. Like our brain is like
speak as well. Just
I mean, our brains are just goo and our thoughts are goo and they're just electricity firing all over the place. And trying to create a coherent thread of thought from all of that incoherence is actually that's like why writing a book is a crazy process. But air is also a really bad place to have a conversation because air is wispy and fluffy. And if I say something and you say something, it goes away. And so that's why having a shared place for the conversation is so deeply transformative. And I don't care if it's a whiteboard. I mean, can you imagine having some of the conversations we try to have without a whiteboard? Yeah. It's mind-boggling. And sticky notes, and that's why people are so stressed out right now in this remote moment of like, well, what do I do? Do I use Mural or do I use Miro? Like, how do I do it? Can I use Google Slides? It's like, I don't care what your shared interface is, but the dialogue of design needs a place.
Yeah.
It needs a home. And that's why having quote unquote war rooms, and we need like a non-military analogy for that. But like, that's why it's so helpful to have those persistent spaces for dialogue where, hey, the group's all in this room and the client comes into this room and we put everything up on a wall and it exists from day to day and week to week. Otherwise it gets, there's so much lost because we just can't hold it all in our heads. And so all of that to me is designing the conversation. Setting up those spaces for the conversation is design. It's a design process.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that the thing that gets overlooked both in those spaces and also on the current kind of online or sort of remote thing is asynchronicity. I think for everyone involved. So one of the things is obviously it's very useful, particularly if you've got something very political, to be able to have everything up on the wall and bring different groups of people through at different times. It's also useful to have everyone together in the same place and looking at it. But that's a kind of different kind of conversation, isn't it? Than I'm going to bring engineering through and then I'm going to bring the marketing team through rather than having all those people in the room at the same time. Because
of my friend Leland, I went to the a week-long negotiation intensive at Harvard Law School. He, in our podcast interview, he said it was like the best educational experience of his life. And it was a lot of money to invest at the time for me to spend $5,000 to go to a week long and to hang out with a bunch of lawyers. But I learned so much. I know. Well, but I learned so much. It was a wonderful intellectual vacation because it was thinking about things in a new way. And I met my professor, Bob Bordone, who I had on the podcast. Like, I learned so much from this process because he talks about creating negotiation systems inside of organizations. And the idea that you can over-engineer a negotiation system or a negotiation so that no real dialogue happens. And so in a way, like if you fracture the dialogue so much and control it, and I'm sure I know for myself that I've committed this act in a workshop, that I have fragmented and templatized and gotten people to like nuggetize everything so that the conversation is super, super safe. And there's no crosstalk, and there's no argument, but there's also no friction and nothing interesting that happens. And so there's definitely the spectrum, right?
Yeah, it is, and it's fascinating. I think one of the things I first learned when I first started teaching actually was I kind of went in and I was sort of teaching from my experience, and that kind of worked pretty well. And then I got very interested in learning more about teaching, and I did a graduate certificate, which is like a kind of third of a master's in university learning and teaching and understanding, how you teach adults. And there's a lot you learn around learning and stuff and self-development things, which is good.
Androgogy, the weirdest, one of the stranger words.
And then you get, and so one of the things though was, then there's all this literature about how to construct a learning experience and everything, and kind of threw myself into that and started really planning all of my courses and kind of over-planned them. And then there was a sort of semester where I just thought, well, not even a semester, there was a sort of few weeks where I just thought, this is not only a little bit boring for me now, because I feel like I'm just sort of painting by numbers. I could tell it wasn't, there wasn't any room for kind of, for that. And so I sort of loosened it again afterwards. And I found that often with workshops too, I've seen, otherwise very competent designers and often, facilitators, or maybe they're a little bit nervous, kind of have like a spreadsheet of this 5 minutes is going to be that, and then the next 10 minutes is going to be that. And, really down. And I just can't, I mean, other people maybe work that way. I just can't work like that. I have a kind of loose outline and a rough sort of points to hit.
But you have a backstop of experience. I mean, okay, so I think you kind of need that and then know where you need to loosen up from that.
We need some squash and stretch, right? So you need to be able to, sometimes you do need to kind of drag something out or let something unfold, like a conversation. So there are sometimes a particular activity triggers people, right? Triggers the group, and then they, I'm always loath to kind of really wade into that, because sometimes I feel like this,
but that's a choice. But that's so this is where we, like in the book, and I talk about what your conversation OS is, and it's like what when you look at all the design things that are designable or addressable in a conversation, then we have a series of choices that we tend to make. And you could say, like, this is Andy's conversation DNA. My mother, who will definitely listen to this episode, she once said to me, she's like, Daniel, I don't always want to be designing my conversations. And I was like, Mom, that is a design choice. And she was like, right. It's like, and so I've incepted her with this. And sometimes I think that the only design choice ever is tight or loose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably the case with a lot of things that it's that classic thing, if you restrict your color palette and that kind of, or the grid, all of those things are, and you have a grid in order to break the grid. Right, exactly, right, to break out the grid.
Because then you get some freshness from breaking it, right? So it's only from the elimination of constraints that we get something new. Right, which is the problem with teaching somebody a way that things are done.
And I think about I don't know if you found this. This is one of the constant struggles of teaching. Is when you know, there's something really nice about knowing your material really well, and you can look at it, all the different sort of metaphors and ways of explaining it, and you're trying to kind of find that kind of key to unlock it for someone. Versus, I've taught this workshop now 20 times and I've kind of lost the will to live about it. There is, and that's where I think some of that kind of constraints versus looseness kind of comes in, because you can also end up going so loose that you go, everyone knows this, so I'm just going to move on. And you've left people sitting there confused because you haven't sort of brought them on the journey with you. Right?
Yeah, I have felt that. And I think that's why teaching design thinking to non-designers got to be a grind for me, because it's like Groundhog Day, like where he goes like, "Hey Ned," like you go through all the actions and you rev people up. And so I think the only way that I solved that for myself is that's one of the reasons why I started teaching my facilitation masterclass. So I get together a bunch of people who are already good facilitators, and then we just blow each other's minds together. And the minus is I sometimes feel like I'm not teaching anything because I'm just coaching and holding space, and I'm feeding into the process. But it is also very satisfying, and I learn something new every time from them, and it elevates my game every time I do it. And that's nice.
You just described you designing a conversation, right?
So
look, you've got a structure to this though in the book. Right? You talk about the conversation OS and the kind of 9 elements of it.
I know.
And you have a canvas of sorts as well.
One must. As one must.
So take us through it.
It's all designed for the conversation of thought leadership.
So take us through it. Right?
Well, so I mean, a lot of it comes from two sources. One is from Paul, actually. So Paul's diagram with this idea of what a conversation is made of. There's people in the conversation, and then there's their goals and what they can agree to, right? Which is like the flip side of goals and agreements. And those each of the if we model a 2-person conversation, we're like, okay, we've got these 2 people, they each have something they want, and can they get someplace together? What Paul doesn't talk about in his model is things that have come up in my own research, like power and like narrative. So narrative to me is something that's always been a big component of what I do. I feel like narrative and narrative structure holds so much. But when you talk about conversation, this woman from Google I interviewed, Google uses some good conversation theory as the basis of their human computer conversation design, which unfortunately now is like taking over this term conversation design.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they talk about is threading. And in the conversation theory, there's this idea of the thread of a conversation, but it's poorly defined. But we all know it from our own experience. We've lost the thread, or we pick up the thread, and the bigger thread is when we have an agenda and a facilitation, or the story of our organization, right? When we can say, like, what's the metaphor? Like, this organization is like if we can say what is happening in our organization, I think we are picking up many, many threads and bundling them together and saying, this is the story of what's happening in this whole organizational conversation.
I mean, some of it's also about uncovering what the actual conversation is, or the actual thread is, versus what the kind of explicitly stated one is. I mean, that kind of tacit culture and tacit narrative versus the real one, which we're right in the middle of the sort of coronavirus thing you're seeing exposed quite brutally sometimes from different companies, right?
Yeah, so like with anything, like I feel like with the 9 elements, and I made it 9 elements because I was doing the podcast for like a year and a half, and I was still teaching facilitation, but through the lens of design thinking and a lot of what I learned from Dave Gray, opening, exploring, and closing, just basic good structure. And I honestly didn't know how to start bringing the OS stuff into it because it felt so weird and theoretical. So I was always looking for ways to ground it. And so I was like, what's the smallest number of elements that I can give? And that 9 box is sort of nice. Yeah. And so at one point, what I put in the middle was invitation. Yeah. So invitation is what kicks off a conversation. And I learned about the importance of invitation I interviewed this guy, Daniel Mezek, who talked about open space conversations, open space technology, and invitation and how you start or frame or hold a conversation. So important. And I feel like half the time when I'm coaching somebody, doing leadership coaching or whatever, and they're like, well, I need to talk to this person about blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, how can you actually frame it so that they'll want to actually come into the dialogue? How can you send somebody invitation to a party that they'll want to come to? And so invitation is terribly important, but I no longer have invitation in the middle. I have it on the edge, and what's in the middle is the interface. Yeah. Because the interface is from in terms of like what's designable and what's addressable, the interface is like right there in the middle where everything comes together. So the interface is crucial. The narrative is crucial. The conversation is made out of people. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if there's one person in the conversation or 100. It's shaped by the people that are invited in, either and then it's also shaped by power, because whether or not people feel like they can speak or feel like they can show up or can bring their whole selves. So power and diversity are both like really important components, and there's kind of like 2 sides to one coin.
Particularly in those. Well, both in the kind of just general daily dynamics of work and sort of corporate spaces and meetings, but particularly in workshops too, right?
Oh yeah, totally. And there's 2. It's funny, writing the book was such an interesting process because I had these 9 elements, and I kind of wrote a little mini chapter for each one about like the principles and the story and blah blah blah. And then I sent it to the publisher, and they're like, 3 of these seem like they're all the same. And I was like, they're not the same. They're totally different. Yeah, I will tell you. Turn taking, which is so very essential, and cadence.
Right. Okay.
Which is like the rhythmicity of all the turns taken.
Yeah.
He's like, but isn't that just an emergent? I mean, he didn't say the term emergent property, but he's like, isn't that just the same thing? And I was like, but cadence is something you feel, and cadence is a little fluffier because I think each of us has like, this is the sprinting thing. Like there's some people like my cadence as a design thinking facilitator 5 years ago was go, 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 rah, rah, rah. And that was just my approach to everything was like, let's go fast. Yeah. And now after several years of doing more men's work, like, and I'm like, now like, let's slow everything way down. And I have that range. And so the turn taking kind of fits inside of the cadence. I feel like we feel the cadence, and then, we the knob that we turn is sometimes the turn taking. And then the third one was threading. He was like, but aren't they all just the same? Like macro, micro, and mezzo. And I'm like, yeah, but they different.
Are. I mean,
you can design them differently.
If I think of, storytelling or a film and stuff, a turn taking happens within a scene. You see it in dialogue, and the sort of a classic thing where one person wants something off the other person and attacks them in various different kind of ways to try and get that thing. And then you
have pace in a scene.
Yeah, right. And so, but you've got this whole thing of first someone might try and be kind of schmooze someone into it, and then the next thing they start to become verbally threatening, and then they start to kind of become physically threatening stuff. So all that stuff kind of that
and so that's the musicality, and that's why I think I try to talk about, there's this idea of like what sounds and combinations of sounds are interesting. Music will tell you, like forte and forte piano and mezzo forte, and then a glissando. And that to me is like the musicality is where cadence goes like slow, slow, quick, 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 slow, slow. And a great movie has that, like, it's not just all slow, because that's boring, and it's not all fast, because then you just need to. Right, it is. I was exactly right. I don't know. Smoking, a lot of smoking, and then like the credits gazing roll, out.
And you think, what? Nothing's happened.
Right, but then like you have the second Matrix movie where I literally needed to take 3 Advil and take a nap after the 2-hour chase scene that is the second Matrix, which I will watch anytime. I love it. It's a great movie. But
yeah, it's interesting that actually, that just as a complete side thing. I mean, I it's probably just an example of getting old, but I have to say, I don't get to go to the cinema very often because I've got an 11-year-old daughter, and when I do, I get I'm fortunate if I get to go and see a Pixar film or something.
Yes,
but like to go and see a full-on Marvel movie or something just feels like an assault, and I just feel battered.
Right, but think about think about the people who listen to Tchaikovsky.
Sure the same.
Right. That's what I'm saying is that like our tastes evolve and our flavors. So like right now, I think in the sprint world, a lot of sprint people are like called now to do other types of workshops, and they have less resources for these other things. People are coming to be saying like, I have to do these strategic conversations and leadership conversations, and the tools of the sprint are a greatest hits of design thinking, but they're not enough to do some of these other things.
Yeah. And I think some of the reflection time, basically time, because that's also what's going on in a story or in a well-structured story. That's, you can't have a climax without having the kind of the softer bit beforehand, or the denouement afterwards, right? So you have to, if you don't have the valley either side, you don't have a peak, right? If it's just all peaks, it's just kind of shouting. And so I definitely think for your brain, though, I really think we're pretty hardwired to have conversation. Of course, the thing around active listening, and if anyone's ever done that kind of exercise when you're learning to kind of interview users, where you're forced to ask a question and then not say anything for a couple of minutes, it's excruciating because it kind of the silence stretches out, and it makes you feel and you learn the kind of power of using silence to kind of draw people out and so forth. But all of those things allow you, the reasons for doing that is the person's already coming up with their answer in their head before you've even finished asking the question, and that comes out. And then if you say nothing, it gives them a time to think, plus they want to fill the awkward silence, and then they kind of say the thing that they want to say. And that's why classically, as you're walking out the door, they say, well, the real problem here is, and I turned off my audio recorder.
So this is designing for the material. this is why I think conversation is a material and why we have to understand the material better. My first year of design school was like, okay, let's design for sand cast aluminum. Let's design for molded plastic.
Yeah.
They're different design processes, and there's different things that each process demands of you. And so my friend Nick, who is a wonderful young man and an amazing designer, was struggling with like his first serious girlfriend, because he's like, she tells me a problem and then I give her some options and she gets angry with me. And I was like, oh, this is classic. I was like,
giving solutions.
Nick, what do you do when you interview somebody for like doing user interviews? And he basically like could rattle off, because he's a very smart designer. He rattled off all the things you just said. Oh, well, I ask them really good questions. I leave pauses. I don't fill the silence. And I was like, well, why not? And he's like, well, I really want to get their ideas and not my ideas. Like, oh, so like, why do you ask really good, clear questions? He's like, well, I really design my questions to make sure that I get the information I want. And I was like, and when they give you an answer, do you ask your next question? He's like, no, I ask really thoughtful follow-up questions to make sure I probe their mental model thoroughly. And I was like, all right, your girlfriend is the research subject and you're the user researcher.
She's the user of you.
Yeah. And you need to design this conversation to get the best information out of her. And I when I say to Janet, my fiance, when she comes to me with a problem, I'm like, do you want me to coach you? Do you want me to
That's bold.
fix you? Or do you want me to hold you? Like, do you just want to be listened to, or do you want solutioning? And I was like, you get to choose. But here's the thing. I've made a choice already, because a lot of people don't know what their choices are. Nick wasn't making a choice, right? Nick was going by reflex. And this is where you talk about an OS and changing your OS. He was introducing just a tiny bit of slower, squishier cadence into his conversation to be like, okay, I'm going to take a moment. And I'm going to be like, okay, where do you want this conversation to go? She's like, I really would love for you to just tell me that my boss is terrible. Like, cool. Like, I want you to agree with me.
That's like, do I look fat in this question?
Right.
Does my bum look big in this?
But treating my fiance like an adult human being, which she is, and saying like, what do you want? And letting her check in with herself and saying, I just want you to listen to me, or no, I actually really need you to help. Like, and I'll tell her, like, I would love for you to listen and to like tell me what you think is possible in this, because I don't know what's possible.
There's a very good podcast called Script Notes, and by Craig Mazin and John August, and both very wonderful screenwriters. And John August has this thing where he's got a couple of people who he trusts to read. Well, not even the first draft, but the kind of first draft he's willing for anyone to read. And one of those people always says to him, well, do you want me to tell you what's wrong with it, or do you want me to tell you it's great?
Yes.
And it's a kind of, a nice way of kind of paraphrasing that thing of, no, actually, I just want you to tell me I'm just not a complete waste of time, or no, I'm feeling strong enough for you to actually get dug into that.
And I was just talking to somebody about this. I interviewed Aaron Irizarry and Adam Connor on my podcast about discussing design, which is, my God, one of the most important conversations that needs to be well designed. What type of feedback do you like when you show somebody a demo, going way back to that, when you show somebody a demo, do you say, do you like it? Or do you say, what don't you like about it? Or do you say, tell me how you would use this?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've had this conversation before, because I've been teaching this course called Leading Conversations on this Masters of Design, and I've talked about it a few times on the podcast. My colleague Jan Eckert wrote this really good paper about this point, which was there's a whole lot of stuff you don't get taught in design school, and particularly once you get into kind of leadership position, that all of your effort is actually around leading conversations, and it's not around. It's very little of it is, this is a really difficult design problem I can't solve. It's really about people stuff. And yet, you don't really get taught it kind of properly in design school. And it's interesting for me, I've taught in Switzerland, in Germany, in England, and in Australia, and other places in workshops, but in sort of academic settings, all of those places. And the cultural difference is amazing. Like the crit sessions in the UK are renowned for being really brutal. Whereas in Australia and in Switzerland, you go, so, what do people think of this? Yeah, it's great. Yeah, but why is it great? do you know, I just really like it. And I thought, oh, it drives me nuts. So a lot of the effort then starts to go into how do you critique work? How do you talk about the work in a useful way? But I see that kind of ripple into sort of professional settings too. And it's surprising how difficult it is actually to get that kind of crit culture, partly also because of a time thing, right? Because you need to actually sort of make some time in a safe space and all of that stuff for that to happen. And if everyone's sprinting, no one's really, you've got time for a kind of a retro, but that's not quite the same thing, right? I
call this I always try to get people to use the analogy of like, who here takes showers on a regular basis? And I was like, oh yeah. I'm like, who here takes a bath on a regular basis? They're like, no. It's like, what's the function of a bath? And they're like, it's definitely not to get clean. It's to enjoy it. I'm like, okay, this is a bath. Like nice. We want you to take a bath in this data and really just like get some bubbles and some candles, lights, nice. Just like, but people don't have time for that anymore. And, but oh man, it's so frustrating. Cause like, what could you possibly expect to get out of 2 weeks of user research if you're not willing to spend at least a couple of days analyzing it?
Yeah. I mean, I was caught on
why bother?
A LinkedIn thread about this recently about, the need to take the time and the need to, I was talking about red teaming. So I was talking about this idea of, that Zoom clearly didn't do, which was you need to take some time to try and really break and abuse the thing you're making and think about all the different ways you could kind of possibly hijack it. And then someone wrote, well, that's all very good, but in a startup, I'm in a SaaS startup and that's just a luxury we don't have. And I kind of thought, well, if not then, when? Because if you're successful and you grow, well, you never have time for it then, right? And then it's a real problem. And then you get to the kind of Facebook thing where, 1% of people being excluded or biased against is, 20 million people or whatever it is. It's
this is cadence, right? So to me, like people don't realize that silence is just as important as talking, and listening is not the opposite of speaking. It's actually necessary. It's two sides of one coin. And so if we only have talking and we never have listening, it's not a conversation. Yeah. And if we only have speed and we never have rest, it's not a conversation. So I feel like maybe the essence of the whole thing is balance, which is, an unsatisfying conclusion. But
I refer to it as kind of mindfulness in design, but that's annoyingly kind of hipster, really, because it's...
but it's less so now, right?
Well, yeah, I know, but that's the thing. But it is a bit of that, which is to take the time with intent to do all of those things. And I have a great quote from Usain Bolt, and he said, it's something like, sleep, how important sleep is to me. Half of my training happens when I'm asleep, which is why I'm hoping if I sleep a lot, I'll end up with a body like him. But that point in time, if because I started looking into sprinters, right, and thinking, well, what is a sprint? If you were sprinting all the time, what triggered this actually was a sprint team who had got to the end of a very long set of fortnightly sprints, so to launch the kind of first iteration of something, and they'd been doing it for several months, right? So even then, sprinting sort of fortnightly sprints for several months was pretty tiring. And their boss was like, well done, tomorrow we get started on the next one. And I just thought, wow, you kind of need to give them, just not burn them out for starters, but also some time to, unpack what they've learned over those, it was like 14 sprint cycles, like 28 weeks.
I interviewed this woman on my podcast named Kate Corford, and she introduced me to this 4 seasons model of conversation design, but she uses it to design her school. She has a school for the arts, and she uses winter, spring, summer, and fall to design every. Oh, this is amazing. We can talk about this. She uses it to design every lesson, every week, the whole semester. And this idea of winter is about reflection, and spring is about planting the seed, and summer is about tending the crops and sweating things out, and fall is about celebration. And good God, this leader needs to know a little bit about how. You look at a sprint, and literally most workshops are missing half of this. There's no reflection and there's no celebration.
Yeah. So my whole talk was all about it's called the 4 Seasons of Design, and it was that very thing that and in
who else talks about this? I didn't know that anybody else like this is fascinating.
I don't know. So it came from I know Kate actually, or of Kate, and I was a talk I gave a couple of times in Australia, and it was once in Barcelona, and it was a. So when I was a kid, one of the books I used to look at was the the book version of the Eames Power of 10 film, after which this podcast is named. And then the other thing was the Self-Sufficiency Handbook by, I think it's John Seymour. And in it had these kind of nice illustrations, those kind of like old textbook style kind of illustrations. And it had the sort of the summer garden, the spring garden, autumn, I've got those out of order now, and winter garden. And what you do at each time. So there's always work to be done. But what I kind of liked about it was this idea of, and that's what my talk was about, was this idea of, and you can kind of start anywhere, but in spring, spring is like the kind of design research phase and conceptual phase. That's where you're kind of sowing the seeds for everything and kind of pretending that kind of preparing everything. Once something launches, you're in summer and, make hay while the sun shines, and everything kind of grows explosively, right? And it kind of gets a little bit out of control. And then come autumn, you start to kind of tend to things and pare stuff back and kind of sort of set things up for the winter. And then in winter, in the northern hemisphere, you stop, right? And certainly, peasants, medieval peasants literally used to stop. They would kind of spend almost the whole time doing nothing and sleeping, and kind of partly because they couldn't, but partly because they were conserving kind of food and energy and staying warm and stuff. But it makes it this very introspective time.
Yes.
And then, you sort of go inwards, and then I think that's partly what's been so depressing about the whole coronavirus thing for a lot of people in the northern hemisphere, is the moment in time where you feel like you're just coming out of winter and you should be kind of blossoming and going outside. Yeah. You're stuck inside. So I was talking about that, whether that's a daily thing or a weekly thing or a monthly or a yearly thing for people in project teams, that's really, really important to kind of have a cadence.
Yeah. And this is where the power of having a shared narrative, having a shared process, having a shared ritual is so powerful, to be like, okay, it's time to high five and have a celebration of the harvest.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And
actually have a harvest celebration and a feast of Thanksgiving.
It's true. I mean, all those things are not there for no reason. That's the kind of
they're human.
Yeah.
They're human.
Yeah.
And I think we need it.
I'm very fortunate where I live that there's still quite a connection to the land. So we really have a lot of seasonal food, and now we're coming into strawberry and asparagus time, and then we'll be coming into
you
the
all
kind
love
of
your white
wine.
asparagus.
Yeah, exactly. And then you come into the kind of wine, the new wine, and then the kind of wine and all of this stuff. So it's a thing I really kind of enjoy about living here, that I felt sort of disconnected to in Australia and in the UK, where you've got sort of everything all the time.
Yeah, but it's a total side note, but the food in Australia is wonderful because so much of it is local, and
it is, yeah. And it's a permanent, that and coffee is a sort of permanent source of conversations.
It's the lucky country.
So listen to one last thing. So you've got on your grid, you've got people, invitation, power, turn taking, interface, cadence, threading, goals. And there's one last thing, which is error and repair. And before we go, I just kind of wanted to tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way I talk about it in the book, and the easiest way to sort of notice is that eventually we will always bang into each other in conversations. And the easiest one is like people just will talk at the same time.
Yeah.
And so if we talk at the same time, if there's a pause and we both start, we collide, we bounce off of each other, and we go, no, you
like being on the pavement and kind of walking.
Yeah. And so somebody has to yield a turn, or somebody has to be more forgiving. And when I think about, if we dive into like the operating system, like what is your OS of error? There's some people who are always on a trigger hair and everything is a slight. And there's other people who like
not someone who's in the White House at the moment.
Let's
not go there.
Well, let's not go there. I know it's so embarrassing.
Yeah.
But the flip side is just as bad, which is like either not seeing the slights or not feeling like you can do anything about them. And so error, like the question in the OS of error is, how do we know if somebody has made a mistake? And when I teach in my in-person master classes, and we haven't done it in my online master class yet, we talk about this idea of difficult people.
Yes.
When we unpack, rather, I used to teach a model of difficult people, and I don't teach a model anymore. What we do is we say, what are the types?
Yeah.
And then what are our choices? And one team said, okay, each team sort of develops their own that they focus on and what their options are. And this one team was said, well, let's unpack what the unmet needs are for all of these people. And I was like, oh, wow, this is so beautiful. Because instead of looking at a difficult participant as somebody who's opposing my agenda and not going along with my plan and who is slowing things down and making me look bad, you can say, well, here's a person who has some needs, and what aren't they getting right now? And how can I make sure that I provide a good experience for all of the people in the room? Right. And so that's where you look at error management. It's like, for a facilitator, I try to just take the 10,000 foot view and say, well, what's really happening here and what's my real goal, and not get offended by somebody showing up late or needing to leave early, which I used to as a facilitator be like, when somebody comes up to you and says, I need to miss an hour, like I need to leave an hour early. Will I miss anything? And I'm like, no, you can totally leave an hour early and it'll be the same experience. And there's this thing that rises up in me where I'm like, right. And that's my error recognition mechanism in me being like reactive. And so I think you can look at that part of the OS as your reactivity.
Yeah.
But also like what you think is possible to do. Because right now I was just coaching a young woman who works at a major bank on a design innovation team, had just hired her first person on that team. She's got a boss. She's like a team of one. Now she's a team of two. And she chose this person internally. And it turns out she's a dud. And so HR is like, okay, well, now you have to start this process whereby you make her want to quit, because we can't really put her anyplace else. Right. I hear you breathing in. And she's like, but I want to do something more human. And so she's actually like, well, how do I actually heal this breach?
Yeah.
How do I explain to her what she's doing wrong? And I'm like, well, do you think it's possible? Is she coachable? Can you teach her how to do this thing? Or is she actually insalvable? Like, does she want to learn? And so if you say to somebody, hey, we need to talk, right? That's the classic, that's like, oh my God, you're breaking up with me. Yeah. That's what everyone thinks. Like, oh God, it's over. And so how do you actually invite somebody into a conversation where you're like, hey, listen, so like, this isn't working, but I'd like to know if it can work.
Yeah.
So what do you think we can do? And that's that process of like, how do you manage that? How do you spot and heal errors? And it's tremendously important. And it's really hard.
It's amazing how much human resources has taken the human out of that stuff. I mean, I know from my experience, lots of people have had it that, because it's sort of it's actually become sort of how to legally protect the company rather than kind of, the human side of things. It ends up, the stuff that's put in place to so tight, going back to the very beginning, to so tightly control the conversation ends up with some really toxic kind of experiences going on all around. I mean, I've seen managers who are like, I just want to go and say to him, what the truth is, but, I can't do it. And, he's, and all of that kind of stuff. It just boggles my mind. It kind of needs to be sort of redesigned from the ground up.
And she has to find a human. This is actually what the word she used, ironically, is human.
Yeah.
Where she was like, I want to find a more. I asked her why she loved design thinking and whether or not she'd expressed that to this woman. And she was like, it's because it's this human process and it's about the humans. And I was like, okay, well, this is HCD, right? How can we have a human-centered design approach to this process? And who are the humans? There's these two women and the organization has needs, and these people have needs. And when you talk about error and repair, like this woman needs to be able to express what she needs and say, I'm not getting what I need from you.
Yeah.
This is not working. And this is one of the hardest things to do, is to say, this is not working for me, in such a way that somebody can actually start the next conversation with you of, now what's next?
Yeah, it is. Hey, listen, it's been fascinating. We could carry on the conversation for a long time, but we're coming up to time. It's gone quite long today. As you know, the podcast is named after the Eames film with Powers of 10, the different relative sizes of things in the universe. And so my final question is always, what one small thing, either that's poorly or well designed and overlooked, needs to be rethought or reconsidered and understood that would has an outsized influence on the world.
Yeah. And not for nothing, I think that thing is conversations. But if you were to dive a little bit more deeply into it, I think turn taking is one of those things that is so easy to fix. And lately with remote distributed dialogue, I do these warm-ups where we pass the mic.
Yeah.
We had an extended mic check, right?
Yeah.
Is this thing on? So you do a mic check, but then you have to pass the mic. And modeling mic passing and being like, okay, so I'm going to talk and then I'm going to pick someone else who's going to talk and then everyone's going to talk.
Yeah.
That to me is like this very, very fundamental thing of turn taking.
Yeah.
And if we can repair that or redesign it better, we can have tremendously more powerful and inclusive dialogues. And I have a feeling you have got a visitor.
Well, I was just going to say that, the turn taking is the ultimate sort of slowing down too, right? I mean,
yes.
And when you think of games and stuff, what you're really doing is kind of completely deliberately and intentionally slowing it down with different rules and stuff in order to kind of create some kind of different experience.
Yeah. And if you can set up the rules that everyone's going to take a turn.
Yeah.
If you can set up the rules that it's worth hearing from everybody. And it takes a little bit longer if you've got a larger group, but it's worth doing so that everyone knows that everyone is allowed to contribute. So that to me is like turn taking is the most physical, the most noticeable, the most controllable thing that if we're designing conversations, it's like, okay. And when we go to coffee, it's very natural. You're like, oh my God, I've been talking the whole time. What's going on with you? Right?
It's not natural to everyone.
Right. And so if we can become aware of, wow, men talk more than women. They hold the floor longer and they take the floor more often than women do. Why is that? Should it be that way? Why should men and women who are 50-50 in the population, if pretty much, why should men speak like 60 or 70% of the time and women speak 40 or 30% of the time? Well, that just is patently absurd. If everybody's in the room, why aren't we hearing from everybody?
There's a lovely cartoon with a guy dressed in a sort of hot dog costume at a party. He was the only one like that at the party, and he's talking to a woman and he says, but enough about me. What do you think of me?
Right.
And it's how brands often kind of talk to their customers.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much for taking your turn with me here on Power of 10.
And I'm excited to have you on to talk about leading design.
Let's do that.
Design conversations.
Let's do that, dude. So where can people find you on the interwebs?
Oh man, it's so easy. I'm pretty SEO'd. I think there's not that many at Daniel Stillman, so they can go to danielstillman.com, but there's honestly not much there. The Conversation Factory is where my podcast is and where you can download free chapters of my book. You can get most of it from the first 2 chapters, honestly. So save yourself. No. Actually, somebody said like, "Wow, you stopped the free sample at the perfect time," because you want to read the 3rd section.
It's a well-designed conversation.
I had that conversation with my editor. But yeah, so that the theconversationfactory.com is a place where you can find all things.
And on Twitter,
design. I'm at DA Stillman. And also on Instagram, if you want to see a picture of 36 frozen balls of cookie dough. That was my last Instagram post.
Very good.
I can't make a whole thing of cookies. I will eat all the cookies.
I do the same thing with my bread dough too.
Yeah.
Well, we'll save that for the bread.
The bread episode.
There's quite a lot of those going on right now.
I know.
All right. Look, thanks very much, and you take care.
Andy, thank you for taking this bath with me. It was wonderful.
Thanks.
All right.
As I'm sure you're aware, you've been listening to Power of 10. My name is Andy Pillane. You can find me at Ep11 on Twitter or Pillane.com, where you can find more episodes and sign up for my newsletter, Doctor's Note. If you like the show, please take a moment to give it a rating on iTunes. It really helps others find us. And as always, get in touch if you have any comments, feedback, or suggestions for guests. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.